10 o'clock on a Tuesday here, live from the campus of Dixie State University. You're watching Talking Point Live. I'm Eric Young, along with Jennifer Kohler. A new law in Indiana has both traditional media and new media all abuzz with what's going on there.
Yeah, and I'm asking myself, is it overreaction and hysteria or not? You know, what do we make of all this coverage?
Or a bit of sensationalism. We'll have some answers, hopefully, to those questions when we come back in 1 minute. Stay with us.
There is a place where rocks bleed and nature blushes on a battlefield green with envy, where dimples determine destiny and a tiny wooden T holds the outcome in the balance. There is a place where friends are opponents and opponents are friends, where the prize is elusive, the conquest is captivating, and the score isn't settled till the drinks are down. There is a place.
When I was in foster care, I never knew when I would have to move, so I always had my suitcase ready to go. Then one day, I was adopted. My new parents opened their hearts and home to me. My parents cook my favorite breakfast for me every morning. My parents take me on trips I never thought I would go on. They gave me a home and an even better reason to use that suitcase. My parents aren't perfect, but they're perfect for me.
Welcome back to Talking Point. Eric and I want to deal with the Indiana law that's been causing so much media turmoil this last few days. And to give you a little context for that, he brought it up to me earlier this week and I read the law, I looked it up and I said to Eric, I don't understand what all the excitement's about. I'm not getting from this language in this law why there's so much concern about it. So right away in my mind, I said to myself, in order to interpret the text of this law, I need context around it. There's other stuff feeding into this story besides just the text I'm reading. So what we wanted to point out to you is that that's the case with every message that we encounter in our lives. If we don't have context, we have a much, much harder time interpreting a basic message or the basic text.
We could probably spend an entire episode, if not 2 or 3, on the idea of context, but we won't do that here. We'll maybe lay a framework for that later on. What we do want to lay for you here as a framework to understand what this law in Indiana really means and compare that to some other states, maybe even the state of Utah, and why there's not the same kind of pushback in Utah or Arkansas as we're seeing in Indiana. Why is that happening in Indiana? So let me do a little recap of what the law means. And it comes back to legislation passed in 1993, originally within the Clinton administration. And the law was the
Restoration of Religious Freedom.
Restoration of Religious Freedom Act, there we go. And that law is somewhat mirrored in Indiana's legislation, but there's kind of a two-part process to the law. One deals with the government and the other one deals with the people. And if I can go through and read this to you, instead of trying to put it in my own words so you get what I'm talking about. It's 2 levels. First level is that the law creates 2 criteria by which the state of Indiana can limit a person's right to free exercise of a religion if it is, as the law states, in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest, or it's the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest. And in lawyer speak, what that means is if you feel compelled by your religion, if it's a sincere belief or practice of your religion to not pay taxes, for example, the state of Indiana can come back and say, well, we don't think so, you still have to pay your taxes. Or if you feel compelled by your religion to sacrifice virgins, that's probably not going to hold up in the court of law.
Because they have a governmental duty, right, to prevent homicide.
Exactly.
And to collect taxes.
And to collect taxes to see what's going on. So what becomes controversial about the law, though, is that it also, within the verbiage of the law, goes through and makes legal certain types of religious discrimination. And that's where all this hubbub is coming from. And what's been fascinating for both of us to watch is to see how both traditional and non-traditional media alike have really just kind of conflated on this. This really has caught fire, a theme that I'm going to come back to here in a little bit later on in our second segment of the show. One of the stories that comes out of this is what happened with a little pizzeria in a small town in Indiana, who they were being interviewed by a local television station. It's a father-daughter type of shop. The daughter was being interviewed, and she had indicated during the interview that while they would still serve gays, lesbians, gender transsexual individuals, they would not cater their weddings. And as you can imagine, once this hit the media sphere, the internet and social media, Twitter and so on, word of this spread very quickly, and not before too long, all kinds of pushback was felt by the owners of this pizzeria.
Let me ask you a question. I do have a sense of, when you mentioned social media picking this up, do you think social media led the way on the pizzeria story?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Twitter
all right.
in particularly.
Twitter, okay.
And we talked about how Twitter does that in last week's episode of Talking
Right.
Point, especially when it can be done so anonymously as far as not having any culpability for the messages that you're putting up. Well, it got so bad for the owners of the restaurant that they had to close the restaurant in fear that there might be damages, or in fear for the lives. There was, from reports that I've read, there was gay pornography that was dropped off at the store. There was a Twitter feed, a campaign to lead something more violent against the store, to burn it down, actually.
So some intolerant people.
Very intolerant people coming back to what was going on just because they decided to go through and exercise their freedom of religion in denying
Catering services.
to homosexuals because it goes against their sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, I have my position on this, and I'll come back to that in the third section. What is interesting about this is that there was a crowdfunding organization, GoFundIt.com. Somebody started a crowdfunding source on this website. What crowdfunding is where you put up an idea or a concept or a special nonprofit kind of thing, and people can subscribe to that idea by pledging $10 or $15 or a couple hundred or whatever the case might be. Well, somebody started a crowdsource funding project for Memories Pizza in Welkerton, Indiana. And just within a couple of days, at last count, they've raised over $842,000
by going out of business temporarily.
by temporarily going out of
Yeah.
business under the auspices of, they're fleeing for their lives under the duress of pushback based on their position, their religious position with this law.
This is so interesting to see because all this is outside the traditional mainstream media. This is happening with the Facebook and then the crowdsource funding.
Well, mainstream though has picked up the story. Definitely.
Right. But these other avenues have driven the story.
They certainly have driven the story, but the owner and her dad have been on every talk show circuit around, and it's really gotten an enormous amount of press. And that's the point. The press loves this kind of stuff when there's that kind of drama going on.
Right.
When we have this cultural battle happening between what's perceived to be extremists from the gay community as opposed to extremists from the religious right community. And what we're trying to do here on today's show is give a little different, better perspective on that. I don't agree with the law. I think the law is inherently flawed. I'm guessing maybe you've arrived at that conclusion as well.
Well, what we did is, and we'll talk about this in the third segment, we'll make a little distinction between the federal level of the law, Indiana's version of it, and Utah's version of it, because it turns out there's a difference between Utah's version and Indiana's.
Yeah, one of the questions that we were asking, Jen and I did a radio show on this on Tuesday on our local radio station, 91.3, X91.3 here, and the distinction, where was I going with that?
Well, we were talking about it, and I was reacting, saying, I can't believe this is causing all this excitement.
Right. In fact, you called it an innocuous law.
I did. I called, when I was reading the text, the text of the Indiana's law, I said, this sounds fairly innocuous to me. So there must be something else driving it or pushing it.
Right.
And so we want to talk a little bit about that context.
We'll get into what's happening behind the scenes with this, because what we're being exposed to is not the truth about the law, and by far, as far as what's going on, as we see it light up in the media. So when we come back, I'm going to talk about this in the second segment as far as what new media channels are doing with this, social media in particular, as far as websites and Facebook and maybe Twitter as well. And then in our third segment, we're going to bring it back home to Utah.
We're going to bring it back home, and through this too, we want to touch on traditional media versus new media too.
Okay. All right. Stay with us. We'll be right back. 60 seconds.
I'm a winner. I'm Dixie.
There is a place where the sun doesn't hide in the winter, where the greens stay green and the crimson canyons still glow. There is a place where dimples determine destiny, and a tiny wooden tee holds the outcome in the balance. There is a place where we drive for show, putt for dough, and settle the score with another round. There is a place.
Welcome back to Talking Point Live. We're coming to you live from the campus of Dixie State University in St. George, Utah, and we're glad to have you with us. This morning we're talking about the hubbub surrounding the legislation in the state of Indiana that has deteriorated into this cultural war between.
It felt like a pile-on to
extreme
me,
sides,
with
really.
all these corporations saying, "Oh, we're not going to go there.
Right.
We're going to leave."
Apple said we're going to go.
Yeah, I mean, it just.
Angie's List said we're
it-
going to pull out. The
it had
NCAA
this-
was saying we're not going to participate in the
like
state of Indiana.
everyone pile on here. Okay, so what about new media?
Well, in new media, I started doing a little hunting around here, and it's interesting because we all know that using a Google search engine, we've already established a certain type of algorithm that will feed to us information that we already have some type of bias towards.
We all have our personal
We
algorithm,
do,
right?
but and as you might imagine, my own algorithm might feed more left-leaning, liberal kinds of information to me. But that wasn't the case as I started to look up what Indiana's legislation really got into. Instead, one of the first things that popped up into my feed was a site from The Federalist. And The Federalist is a relatively right-wing publication,
Okay.
new media channel that way. And they put up a story called 10 Americans Helped by Religious Freedom Bills Like Indiana's, trying to go through and turn the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act into some type of a rubric by which all other similar laws might be judged or evaluated, which is not true, by the way. They gave us 10 different examples of Americans who were affected by that. But as I investigated every one of their stories, only 1 out of the 10 was an actual reflection of the Restoration of the Freedom of Religion Act within that reflects in Indiana's law.
Where someone's rights were protected by that.
They were
that
protected
act. Okay.
by the act itself. The story is about a woman by the name of Kawal Tagore. The story reads, after being baptized in the Sikh faith, Kawal began carrying what's called a kirpan. Now, I need to probably explain.
Yeah, I don't know what a kirpan
The
is.
Sikh faith has 5 different articles of faith that they carry with them. One of them being that they don't cut their hair. Another being a special type of cotton underwear. Sounds familiar there, that they wear. Another one being a gold or a steel band that's worn around the wrist. And another being a kirpan. And a kirpan is a knife, actually. It can be 3 to 5 inches long. The one that Kawal had on her was about 3 inches long, and it was more dull than a butter knife, according to the reports there. Now, the problem here is she worked in Houston for the Internal Revenue Service, and as she was recently baptized into the Sikh faith, she comes in with this instrument on her body, and they fire her as a result of having this on her. Where we have obviously other employees dealing with
Scissors,
box cutters and scissors and things of that nature.
Other sharp objects. Yeah.
So she used the religious restoration legislation to go through and sue the Internal Revenue Service. And the judge upheld that her religious liberties were in fact infringed upon by the Internal Revenue Service, and that there was a settlement ensuing as a result of that. So here we have something outside of the very readily, outside of the notion that this is just a law set out to discriminate against the gay community.
And you know, is it time to bring up like why that direction was so evident?
Well, let me
That-
check here
okay.
because
Okay.
there was something
Yeah.
else I wanted to get
Okay.
into. One more artifact
right.
here that I want to get into.
All right.
And what I'm trying to say with this is that this legislation extends far beyond perhaps what could be construed as or what can be seen as, boy, I'm choosing my words too carefully here, because I believe that the law does discriminate against homosexuals. No question about that. But it does also provide protections for other people out there seeking some type of religious protection outside of perhaps what's happening with Christians. Not so much the case, though, with a website that's put out by the Catholic League. Now, this is a pretty old and well-established website. It's a website that's set up to go through and protect Catholics who themselves might be victims of some level of discrimination based on an infringement of the First Amendment or constitutional
Right.
rights that way. What's fascinating about the website itself, though, the story put out by Bill Donahue, who talks about certain aspects of this law, it's how the story itself is framed. Now, we're going to put up an image of the website itself there. The image that comes up, it shows the story and it shows an image involved in that. If you have it, put that up. Now, you see an actual fire with the headline, Indiana Pizza Store Under Fire. Now, if you go to the image itself and bring that up, we're seeing what looks like a restaurant. It says Senor on the side of it, so I'm assuming maybe it's a Mexican restaurant with a late model BMW on fire. This is not the pizzeria in Indiana.
That's reprehensible,
In
I
fact,
think.
it has
That's very
nothing
misleading.
to do with the story
very
at all.
misleading.
So it
Yeah.
sensationalizes this, and the reason why I'm surprised by that is because of the nature of the Catholic League, that they usually have a tendency to be pretty straightforward. In fact, Donahue writes, he says, refusing to serve a gay person in a public accommodation is morally and legally indefensible. But it is equally indefensible to mandate that owners of a private business must violate their sincerely held religious convictions by acceding to a request to service a gay wedding. So it's interesting that it puts this out, and this is where we have rights and religious liberties coming into conflict here.
Well, I know you're a fan of new media, but this points out an important thing to notice. Do you think that misrepresentation, that visual misrepresentation of the fire,
Right.
juxtaposed to the headline,
Right.
would be allowed to appear on traditional television or in traditional print media that is more regulated by trained journalists and regulated by corporate and advertising interests?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I do think that there are some traditional channels that are out there that have let down their guard, so to speak,
Okay.
or really don't care. The
Okay.
more sensational, the better.
Okay, so maybe they're following the lead of new media in the sense that there's a lack of responsibility often in presenting information.
Right.
Lack of self-censorship, a lack of
Or
ethics.
maybe an abundance of an overinterpretation of the law,
Right,
which
Right.
honestly I don't think is really truly the case here.
Yeah.
Let's see, where are we at time-wise?
okay,
One thing, and
Okay.
then we'll go to break with this. So we talked about this in the radio show.
okay,
We talked about the sign in the sandwich shop,
right,
okay, as it comes down to basic rights versus basic religious liberties.
right,
So if I have a sandwich shop and I have a sign in that sandwich shop that says, I refuse the right to serve anybody, I reserve the right to refuse service to anybody, versus a sign in my shop that says, I refuse the right to serve homosexuals, what's the difference between those two declarations that way?
Well, and you were making the case that anybody is such a nebulous, non-targeted term that it doesn't qualify as discrimination. But when you
Based on the individual, not based on what the individual might be associated with.
correct,
Right.
and that the other, by naming a group, then is now guilty of discrimination. And so that's how you were making the distinction.
So what the law in Indiana does, actually, it protects me if I did have that sign up as far as refusing service to gay people because it affected my sincerely held religious
Okay, now
belief.
you're interpreting as a protection, and some of the reading I did by legal people was it opens it up as a possibility for you to file suit, for you to make a claim.
To make a claim then.
To make a claim. So have your day in court.
Right.
So
Or no, it's not if I were the business owner to make that claim or file suit. If I were a business owner and you were offended by that you could sue me,
Right.
I'm protected, not you, not the plaintiff.
I think also, well, okay, there again, I think there's a lot more to than just our interpretation of
You
what
found
it means.
a great quotation, in fact, by a University of Utah professor of
Right.
law. We'll come back to that in
Yeah.
our third segment. Here we'll be
we
back.
want to really talk about Utah's version of
Right,
this.
and how that factors into this. And
Yeah.
why did Indiana get this buzz in the first place?
Yeah.
Jen has a fascinating theory on this, and we'll talk about that in 60 seconds. Stay with us.
Oh, look, a redhead.
Staring contest.
You still got it. I know.
Come alive with the forest.
The dad was cute.
You were looking right Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
There is a place where looking out means looking in, where an impression lasting only a few seconds will be imprinted on a life forever, where courage is forged and innocence rediscovered, where remembering is rewarding and forgetting unforgettable. There is a place where truth is felt and where seeing is believing. There is a place.
Welcome back to Talking Point Live. This is our last segment of the show today, and we really want to zero in a little bit more on the difference between Indiana's law and Utah's law and some other issues related to this. When Eric and I were talking about this earlier, I mentioned this at the beginning of the program, that the necessity of having context in order to really read the text. And I couldn't figure out why it caused, because the language seemed innocuous, why it caused such a stir. Well, in my research, I realized that in Indiana, there were some groups that were pushing for the passage of this bill with this language in it. And one of the groups is called
Advance America.
Advance America. And they have an explicit mission, if you will, on their website dealing with LGBT denial of rights, I guess is what you would say.
Yeah.
And so then it began to make sense to me. Oh, well, maybe that's why it's gone this way so heavily, that it's about LGBT rights, because in Indiana, where it was generated, it was being sponsored or pushed by groups, and maybe more than one group.
By anti-LGBT organizations.
Right. But before I had that context, I was speculating, okay, what could the other context be? And there's something causing this to take off. And I had a theory, and then, we figured out that...
Is this the Pence theory?
Yes,
hold
the
on,
Pence
hold on.
theory.
Come back to that.
Okay, come back to
I want
that.
to end with that note as
All
we
right.
go out on that.
Okay.
Tell us
All right.
about what you found from Professor Cliff Roski, the professor at University of Utah,
Right.
as a law professor there.
Okay,
What's
so
he say?
Eric's like, why is Utah not getting hammered like Indiana is? You know, that was still one of our big questions. And when we both looking at the law in Utah, we discovered that the law in Utah is written differently. There's different language in it. And
Well, the language is very specific, in fact.
it's
The Utah law goes
Yeah.
through and guarantees protection for individuals who are discriminated against based on their sexual preference.
or
both-
their religion, or their gender.
No, this one got back, it's explicit language, LGBT, within that, from
Well-
a standpoint of discrimination in terms of employment or in terms of housing.
Right, but the Utah
There is a
law.
second provision
yeah,
tucked
yeah.
into that law, though,
Okay.
that religious liberties would still be protected within the law as well.
Well, I'm thinking of the language that I saw for Utah's law that said, it mentioned sexual preference, gender, and religious all in one sentence.
In one sentence,
One
okay.
sentence
All right.
of protection for Utah. And so what was interesting that Cliff Roski, he's our University of Utah professor, he made a distinction between Indiana and Utah, and he said Utah is actually writing a set of rules as opposed to Indiana stating principles. So because Utah put rules into their law, it leaves it less subject to manipulation and abuse as opposed to Indiana, which has this principle stated, and therefore it's kind of a free-for-all.
So the law being more specific prevents this type of interpretation we're seeing with Indiana's law.
It's rule-oriented versus principle-oriented.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting.
All right, so do you want to talk about Mike Pence?
Okay, let's come back to
Yeah.
Governor
All right,
Pence.
so Governor Pence.
He's quoted as saying, I don't understand why we're getting all this pushback. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And you happened to crystallize this during our radio
Well,
show.
we looked at something. It was it was the NPR article on
Right.
this. And NPR's article mentions, as you go down through the article on the Indiana law, that Mike Pence is a very real potential candidate for the Republican nomination for the 2016 elections for president. So I said, oh, okay, I'll bet you it's some other Republican faction that wants to knock Pence out of the race early, so now they're holding him up to the public spotlight and making him twist in the wind. You know,
So
I was
kind of a
getting
premature
I was
smear
getting
campaign?
Machiavellian about it, right? Yes.
But I think it's a fascinating.
Well, it is interesting.
idea.
So that's my theory, is that the press loves controversy. That's one of their media biases, and they want to make this story, even amplify this story, pile on with this story. And now they're vetting Mike Pence. The media is now vetting Mike Pence to see how he's going to handle it.
What's he going to do?
How's he going to show up as a potential? And oh, I have to admit something embarrassing. I looked at his picture, and I thought, oh, he's really presidential looking.
Oh,
I know, don't you hate that? And I'm like, Jennifer, you know, it's not about the way the guy looks.
well, based on the
Yeah.
same criteria, then Ted Cruz has no chance
Yeah, I have to admit, he never did strike me, but
as presidential.
there goes that bias, that other media bias,
Based on
the,
aesthetics.
the visual
well, he doesn't
bias.
look like a president.
Yes,
Yeah.
what does a president look like? Abraham Lincoln?
Well,
I mean, he wouldn't play well
by
these
today's
days.
standards, yeah,
or
that'd
Howard
be
Taft.
pretty strange
Yeah.
criteria.
So anyway, we have to be cognizant when
So
we're
you're saying
dealing with the media.
that Pence is doing this to go through and maybe vault him into a public light as far
Oh,
as
now
throwing his
see,
head into the
I
presidency?
wasn't even thinking Pence was doing this on purpose. I thought his competitors were making it an issue.
His
but
Republican
you're now
peers.
suggesting,
Oh, I think that's a
you
great.
are suggesting that he's using this as his launch.
Many candidates have done
Oh,
greater
you're-
things
You're
than
always
that
a step ahead of me.
to go through and pole vault him into
Yeah.
the public limelight
Yeah,
there.
what's going on with the media?
So let me establish it here. For the record, though, I don't agree with this legislation at all, and I think it does go through and promote discrimination on many levels, not just in dealing with the lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual community, with atheists or with those who are non-Christians as well. I think it sets a very dangerous precedent that way. What do you think?
Well, like I said, I think there's various states that have modified the federal legislation of '93, and apparently there's some difference from state to state. And I'm glad that Utah's version of it seems to be more equitable, which is what we're after
Right.
here. And before we close, I don't know how much time do we have left, timekeepers?
I think we
3
got about
minutes. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So we covered Mike Pence, but I did notice an interesting quote when I was listening to Dallin Oaks give a talk just last weekend.
Dallin Oaks, an
Yeah.
LDS authority.
Yeah, he was
just last week
he
was General Conference.
He was quoting.
Giving context here.
Yeah, he was quoting Gordon Hinckley, who gave a speech at BYU in 1974.
When he was Elder Hinckley.
When he was Elder Hinckley, and this just rang out for me because this is a lot of my perception around this particular firestorm,
Right.
if you will. And Hinckley is talking about political commentators, and here's the quote: "Aflame with indignation, with studied art, they poured out the sour vinegar of invective and anger. Surely," he concluded, "this is the age and place of the gifted pickle sucker."
The gifted pickle suckers. I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually.
Yeah.
I hope we don't become gifted pickle
No,
suckers and what it is
I'll
that we're
keep
doing.
you from getting too
Too bitter?
too bitter.
I'll keep you from becoming too sweet.
Saccharine?
Is that saccharine? There we
Too
go.
Pollyanna?
Yeah, that's a good one,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll use our critical thinking to try to push through our biases.
There we go. That's what
Yeah.
the show is all about. If you have something to add to the conversation, you're more than welcome to do so on our Facebook page. It's at facebook.com/TalkingPointLive. You'll find us there. And I hope you'll come back. And actually, next week we will not have a Talking Point Live.
We won't?
Because the majority of our crew is going to be in Denver covering a national rodeo event.
Oh, well,
So-
sports always outranks. I realize
There you
that,
go.
critical thinking,
It's a
yes.
self-fulfilling prophecy that
Well,
you...
one reason to go to Facebook too is we ask a lot of questions here. We're not like regular TV that's going to give you all the answers. What we want to do is raise a lot of questions. And so we're directing you to our Facebook because we have links there of the material that we've been looking at this week so that you can vet it yourself and read some of these that are recommended by us to be valuable resources. So,
Facebook.com/TalkingPointLive.
Yeah.
Hope to see your comments there. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks, coming to you live from the campus of Dixie State University. My name is Eric Young.
Jennifer Kohler.
Have a good week.